The city was a beast, especially at night. It growled with far-off sirens and gleamed with wet streets under a hazy moon. In a neighborhood where the buildings leaned in close, whispering secrets to one another, Jade lived in a small apartment that always felt a little too cold. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Her hands wouldn't stay still, twisting together as she paced the worn floorboards. Her best friend, Marco, was in terrible trouble. The kind of trouble that didn't just go away. He had been stupid, trying to get rich quick with a bet he couldn't afford to lose, and he'd lost it all to the most dangerous people in the city, the Rossi clan. Now they had him. And people who owed the Rossis money had a habit of disappearing. Jade was not a fighter, not in the way that involved fists or guns. Her strength was in her mind, in her stubborn will. She had no family, no powerful friends. All she had was her courage, and tonight, she was going to spend every last bit of it. She put on a simple black dress, her disappear-into-the-background dress, but tonight it felt like a suit of armor. She took a deep, shaky breath that did nothing to calm the frantic bird beating against her ribs. She was going to the lion's den. She was going to ask for a meeting with Dante Rossi, the boss himself. The place was a club called the Gilded Cage. The name was perfect. It was all soft music, deep carpets, and men in sharp suits whose eyes were harder than diamonds. They looked her over, this nervous girl in a simple dress, and their stares were like physical touches. She was led to a back office, a room that was too quiet, the air thick with the smell of expensive whiskey and old cigars. And there he was, Dante Rossi. He wasn't a monster made of shadows and scars like she had imagined.
He was solid.
He sat behind a large, dark wood desk, his suit jacket perfectly tailored. His hair was dark, his jaw was strong, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they watched her unmoving as she walked in.
He didn't speak.
He just waited, letting the silence press down on her until she felt she might crumple under its weight. "Where is Marco?" she finally managed, her voice a tight whisper. Dante leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "He is safe.
For now."
His voice was low, calm, and it made her feel even more unsteady. "He owes my family a great deal of money. Money he does not have." "I know," Jade said, forcing her chin up. "That's why I'm here. I want to make a deal." One of Dante's eyebrows lifted, just a fraction. It was the only sign of his surprise. "A deal," he repeated, the word flat. "What could you possibly have that I would want?" This was it. This was the moment her crazy, desperate plan either worked or failed. "Me," Jade said, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. "You let Marco go. You wipe his debt clean, and I will do anything you ask. I'll work for you. I'll clean your offices. I'll do anything." Dante studied her for a long, long time. His gaze traveled from her determined eyes, down to her trembling hands, and back up again. He steepled his fingers under his chin. "You are brave," he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a fact. "But a cleaner is not what I need." He paused, and the air in the room seemed to get even thinner. "There is another problem. The police, other families, they see a man alone as unstable. A risk. They see a man with a wife as settled. Trustworthy." Jade's blood ran cold. She felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I need a wife," Dante said, his stormy eyes locking with hers. "A temporary one. A fake one. You will live in my home. You will appear with me in public. You will act as though you are in love with me. You will be my oi prop. My shield. Do this for 1 year. Play the part perfectly, and when the year is over, Marco's debt is gone, and you will be free. You will have more than enough money to start a new life, far away from here." The world seemed to shrink to this one horrible choice. Marry a monster to save her friend. Live a lie. But the image of Marco, scared and alone, flashed in her mind. She had no other choice. None at all. Her throat was so tight, she could barely force the word out. It was a small, broken sound in the heavy silence of the room. Yes. The transition from Jade's old life to her new one was not a gentle crossing. It was a violent uprooting. One day, she was in her small, familiar apartment. The next, she was standing in the cavernous foyer of Dante's mansion. The air here didn't smell of the city and cheap coffee. It smelled of lemon-scented polish and cold, clean stone. Her few bags, containing the entirety of her old world, looked like sad, lost parcels sitting on the gleaming marble floor. A stern, older woman named Mrs. Agnelli, the housekeeper, had shown her to her room. It wasn't just a room. It was a suite, larger than her entire previous apartment, decorated in shades of gray and beige. It was beautiful, expensive, and utterly soulless. It felt like the most luxurious prison cell imaginable. The rules were established with a quiet, brutal efficiency by Dante himself that first evening. He stood in the doorway of her room, not entering, a king defining the borders of his kingdom. His voice was all business. "You have the run of the house," he said, his gaze sweeping over her, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Except for my study at the end of the West Hall. That is my private space. Mrs. Agnelli will handle any needs you have. You will have an allowance for clothing, anything you need. The goal is to look the part." He then handed her a simple, black leather portfolio. Inside were not love letters, but dossiers. Photographs and biographies of his key men, their wives, rival family members, and important city officials. "Memorize these," he instructed. "You will be expected to know who people are. We will begin our public appearances next week." And with a curt nod, he was gone, leaving Jade alone in the vast silence, clutching the file full of strangers' faces. The first week was a study in isolation. They lived in the same large house, yet they were planets orbiting different stars. Jade would see him at a distance, sometimes heading out in the early morning, his expression grim and focused, or returning late at night, the sound of his car on the gravel drive a signal for her to retreat further into her room. They ate separately. They existed separately. The few times their paths did cross, in the grand hallway or the modern kitchen, the air would grow thick and heavy with a silence that was more than just silence. It was a wall, built from his unreadable sternness and her own simmering resentment and fear. She was playing her part, staying out of his way, but the quiet was deafening. The first test of their charade was a small, informal gathering at the home of his consigliere, an older man named Salvatore. In the car ride over, Dante had been all business. "Stay close to me. Smile. Let me lead the conversation. If you are unsure of something, squeeze my arm twice, and I will handle it." He had looked at her then, his stormy eyes assessing her simple, but now expensive, blue dress. "You look the part," he had said, and it was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her, yet it felt hollow, a comment on a prop. The party was a whirlwind of polished surfaces, low laughter, and watchful eyes. Jade felt like a mouse in a room full of elegant, well-dressed cats. But she held onto Dante's arm, her fingers resting lightly on the rough, expensive wool of his suit jacket. She smiled, a practiced, pleasant curve of her lips. She nodded at the right moments. She remembered names from the dossiers, offering a quiet, "It's lovely to see you again, Isabella," to Salvatore's wife, which earned a slight, approving nod from Dante. She was acting and she was good at it, but it was exhausting. Every smile was a conscious effort, every laugh a calculated sound. She felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions about this new, unknown woman who had captured the attention of Dante Rossi. It was later that night, back in the cold silence of the mansion, that the first crack appeared. Jade, drained from the performance, was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when Dante walked in. The tension from the evening seemed to have followed them home, condensing in the space between them. "You did adequately tonight," he stated, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Adequately. The word slipped out before she could stop it, fueled by a day of silence and a week of pent-up frustration. "I was perfect in there. I remembered every name, every detail. I didn't put a single foot wrong." "It's not about being perfect," he said, turning to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's about being believable. You were stiff. Your smile didn't reach your eyes. People notice that. And how would you know if my smile reached my eyes or not? She shot back, stepping closer, the anger a hot, welcome feeling after so much cold control. You were barely looking at me. You were too busy scanning the room for threats, talking business with your men. You were playing your part, the powerful, distracted boss, and I was playing mine, the quiet, decorative wife. Don't criticize my performance when yours was just as much of an act. For a moment, he just looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not anger, but surprise. No one, it seemed, talked back to him. The air between them crackled. They were standing close now, close enough for her to smell the faint scent of his cologne and the whiskey on his breath. Her heart was pounding, no longer from fear, but from the raw, unexpected thrill of the confrontation. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, and for one terrifying, electric moment, Jade thought he might kiss her. The anger between them had twisted into something else, something hot and sharp and full of possibility. But just as quickly, the shutters came down behind his eyes. He took a small step back, the moment shattered. "Just be ready for the next one," he said, his voice returning to its flat, businesslike tone. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone once more, her body thrumming with an adrenaline she didn't understand. The fight was over, but the silence that returned felt different now. It was no longer just empty, it was charged, waiting. The wall between them was still there, but now they had both touched it, and they both knew it was there. The game had just become infinitely more complicated. The air in the mansion never quite settled back to what it was before the argument. A new, strange energy had taken its place, a constant, low hum of awareness that followed Jade from room to room. She found herself listening for the sound of Dante's footsteps, noticing the particular way he would sigh when reading a report in his study. He, in turn, seemed more present, his gaze lingering on her a second longer when they passed in the hall. The silence was no longer a wall of ice, but a taut wire, vibrating with things left unsaid. The memory of their almost kiss in the kitchen hung between them, a ghost that neither would acknowledge, but both could feel. Their next public outing was a charity gala, the biggest and most important event they would attend so far. The city's elite would be there, along with every major figure from the other families, including the Grecos. The stakes were higher, and the pressure was immense. In the days leading up to it, Dante surprised her. Instead of just handing her a dossier, he sat with her in the library, going over the details himself. "Luca Greco will be there," he said, his voice low and serious. "He is the son of the Greco boss. He is arrogant, and he likes to provoke. If he approaches you, you are to stay by my side. Do not engage with him alone." It was the first time he had spoken to her not as an employer to an employee, but as a partner, sharing a strategy. It made the charade feel dangerously real. The night of the gala, Jade felt like a prize being prepared for display. A team of stylists had descended upon her, and when she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She wore a dress of deep emerald green that seemed to catch the light, and her hair was swept up in an elegant twist. When she walked downstairs, Dante was waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase. He was in a classic black tuxedo, and for a moment, he looked less like a Mafia boss and more like a storybook prince. The look in his eyes as he watched her descend was not one of cool assessment. It was one of pure, unguarded shock, followed by a heat that made her breath catch in her throat. He offered her his arm. "You look perfect," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. This time, the word didn't feel hollow. It felt like a confession. The gala was a sea of glittering jewels and false laughter, 100 times more intense than the first party. Jade held onto Dante's arm, her anchor in the storm. She remembered her training. Her smiles came more easily now, her conversation flowed. She was playing the part, but a part of her was no longer acting. She felt a genuine thrill at being on his arm, a possessive pride when she saw the way other women looked at him. He, in turn, was different. His hand rested on the small of her back, a constant, warm pressure that felt both protective and claiming. He leaned down to whisper in her ear, his breath warm against her skin, pointing out people of interest, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was for her alone. The line between their performance and their reality was beginning to blur, and neither of them seemed to have the will to stop it. It was then that Luca Greco found them. He was a handsome man with a cruel smile and eyes that roamed over Jade with a disrespectful boldness that made her skin crawl. "Dante," Luca said, his voice a silken drawl. "I see you've acquired a new accessory. She's quite an improvement." He turned his gaze fully on Jade, ignoring Dante completely. "And what is your name, beautiful? I can't imagine a delicate flower like you finds much interest in the boring business talks of old men." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her shoulder. Jade froze. Dante's entire body went rigid beside her. The air around them turned cold and sharp. Before Jade could even form a response, Dante's hand shot out, his grip like iron on Luca's wrist, stopping the invasive touch. "She is my wife." Dante's voice was quiet, but it cut through the music and chatter like a blade. Every ounce of the powerful boss was back in his posture, his expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. "You will not look at her. You will not speak to her. You will not touch her." He shoved Luca's hand away with a force that made the other man stumble back a step. The people around them had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold with wide, anxious eyes. In the tense, silent aftermath, Dante turned to Jade. His stormy eyes were blazing with a possessive fire she had never seen before. He didn't say a word. He simply cupped her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the anger rolling off him, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle, polite kiss for the crowd. It was a raw, powerful, and desperate claiming. His lips moved against hers with a hunger that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a kiss meant to send a message to Luca, to the entire room, but as Jade's hands came up to clutch at the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, as she kissed him back with a matching, surprising fervor, the message was lost to the two of them. The world, the crowd, the danger, it all melted away. There was only the heat of his mouth, the solid strength of his body against hers, and the shocking, undeniable truth that this was the most real thing either of them had felt in a very, very long time. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. The crowd, remembering itself, began to murmur and slowly return to their conversations, the spell broken. Dante rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. He looked as shaken as she felt. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain it away as part of the act. He just looked at her, his gaze searching hers, seeing her, truly seeing her for the very first time. The ride home was spent in a silence thicker and more profound than any that had come before. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The kiss had spoken volumes. Later that night, a soft knock came on Jade's bedroom door. Her heart leaped into her throat. When she opened it, Dante was there, still in his tuxedo pants and a white shirt, the top buttons undone. He looked tired and younger, the mask of the boss completely gone. "What happened tonight?" he began, his voice rough. "Don't," Jade whispered, cutting him off. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his lips, stopping the words that would ruin the moment, that would try to box what happened into the category of performance. He looked at her, his eyes dark and full of a war she now understood. Then, slowly, he took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and pulled her into him. This kiss was different. It was slow, deep, and searching. It was not for an audience. It was a question, and as Jade melted against him, her arms winding around his neck, it became an answer. The fake marriage, the deal, the danger, it all faded into the background, overshadowed by the terrifying, exhilarating beginning of something real. The fortress that Dante Rossi had built around his heart did not fall with a crash, but with a quiet, relentless surrender. The morning after the gala, the mansion was no longer a shared space of cold politeness. It was a different world. When Jade came down for breakfast, Dante was already there, sitting at the head of the long table, a newspaper in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and the usual curt nod was replaced by a look, a long, quiet look that held the memory of the night before. He didn't speak, but he gestured to the chair beside him, not the one far down the table. It was a small thing, a tiny shift, but to Jade it felt monumental. The coffee was poured for her, without her asking. The silence that settled between them was no longer empty or charged with anger, but was instead warm, comfortable, like a shared secret. Days turned into a new kind of routine. Evenings were no longer spent in separate wings of the house. Dante began to seek her out. He would find her reading in the library and sit in the armchair opposite, not always speaking, but just being there. He started asking her questions, not about dossiers or performances, but about her. What books did she like? What was she like as a child? He listened, truly listened, his stormy eyes fixed on her, as if her words were the most important thing he would hear all day. One night, he told her about the orphanage his family secretly supported, a place for children who had lost their parents to the very street wars he was a part of. "It's a debt," he said, his voice low, almost ashamed. "A penance." In that moment, Jade didn't see the Mafia boss. She saw a man haunted by the world he ruled, trying to carve out one small corner of goodness. The ice around her own heart, the ice she had formed to survive this arrangement, began to melt. The shift from pretending to something real was not a decision, it was an inevitability. It happened during a quiet Thursday evening. They were talking about nothing of consequence, and Jade made a dry, witty remark that caught him off guard. Dante laughed. It was a real, full, unguarded laugh that transformed his entire face, smoothing the stern lines around his eyes and mouth. The sound of it did something strange to Jade's chest, a warm, fluttering feeling that was both terrifying and wonderful. He looked at her, his laughter fading into a soft, wondering smile. "Jade," he whispered, and her name on his lips had never sounded so intimate. He reached across the space between them, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch sending a shiver through her. This wasn't supposed to happen," he admitted, his voice thick with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I know," she whispered back, her eyes locked with his. "I don't want it to be fake anymore," he said, the words a quiet vow in the hushed room. "Neither do I," she breathed. And that was it. There were no more contracts, no more deals, only the terrifying, exhilarating truth. He leaned in and kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was not about anger or possession or performance. It was slow and tender and full of a promise that had nothing to do with their one-year agreement and everything to do with a future they were only just daring to imagine. That night, he did not leave her at her bedroom door. He followed her inside, and the door closed not on a business arrangement, but on the beginning of something fragile and beautiful and real. For a week, they lived in a blissful bubble, a secret world of their own making within the stone walls of the mansion. They were, for the first time, truly happy. But happiness in Dante's world was a dangerous luxury. The bubble was destined to pop. It happened when Jade, looking for a specific book Dante had mentioned, ventured into his private study. He was out on business, and the room, usually locked, was open for cleaning. Her eyes scanned the shelves, and she found the book. As she pulled it out, a faded, leather-bound journal slipped from behind it and fell to the floor, spilling its contents. It was old, filled with her father's handwriting. Her heart stopped. Her father, a small business owner, had lost everything years ago to a ruthless, hostile takeover by a shell company that had driven him to bankruptcy and an early grave. She had never known who was behind it. With trembling hands, she flipped through the journal, and there, on a loose sheet of paper tucked inside, was a document. It was a transfer of assets. The shell company was named Rossi Holdings, and the signature at the bottom, bold and unmistakable, was that of Vittorio Rossi, Dante's father. The world tilted on its axis. The warmth, the tenderness, the whispered promises, it all turned to ash in her mouth. Dante's father was the man who had destroyed her family, who had broken her father's spirit. And Dante had known. He had to have known. He had brought the daughter of the man his family ruined into his home, made her his wife, made her fall in love with him. It was not a coincidence. It was the final, cruel move in a game of revenge she never knew they were playing. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. She stumbled back to her room, tears of rage and heartbreak blinding her. It was in this state, shattered and furious, that her phone rang. It was a blocked number. A rough, unfamiliar voice spoke. "We have your friend, Marco. He messed up again. If you want to see him alive, come to the old warehouse on the West Pier. Alone. Tell Dante and we'll know. We'll send him back to you in pieces." The line went dead. The trap was set with a master's precision, using her one remaining vulnerability. Blinded by grief and a desperate need to do something, to save someone after feeling so utterly powerless, she made a catastrophic mistake. She didn't think. She didn't question. She scribbled a note for Dante, a single, scrawled line filled with her pain. You knew what your father did to mine." And then, she slipped out of the house, running straight into the waiting arms of the Greco family, who smiled as she arrived alone and helpless, the perfect pawn to finally break Dante Rossi. The silence in the mansion after Jade's flight was not empty. It was a physical presence, a heavy, screaming void that seemed to suck the very air from the rooms. Dante returned home an hour later, a sense of uneasy quiet in the house putting him on immediate alert. He called her name once, twice, his voice echoing through the grand spaces with no answer. It was Mrs. Agnelli, her face pale, who silently handed him the note she'd found on the floor of his study. His eyes scanned the 5 devastating words. You knew what your father did to mine." His blood ran cold. He had not known. Not until recently, not until he'd started digging into her past to understand the woman he was falling for, and the ugly truth of his father's business practices had emerged, a legacy of cruelty he was still trying to untangle. He had been trying to find the right moment, the right words to tell her, to beg her forgiveness for a sin he hadn't committed but his name carried. And now, she was gone, believing the worst of him. The panic that seized him was not the calculated concern of a boss for a valuable asset. It was a raw, primal, and terrifying fear. It was the fear of a man who had just found the one thing that made his life make sense, only to have it ripped away. He roared for his men, his voice cracking with a fury they had never heard before. The mansion erupted into controlled chaos. Phones were snatched, guns were checked, engines roared to life. Dante's stormy eyes were now black pools of pure, unadulterated rage. He was no longer just a boss. He was a force of nature, a man possessed. He knew, with a chilling certainty, where she had gone. The Grecos. They had played on her hurt, on her loyalty to Marco. They had used his own failure to explain his father's sins as a weapon to take her from him. As he sped through the dark streets, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, one thought pounded in his head with every beat of his heart. Jade. The old warehouse on the West Pier was a decaying skeleton of brick and rusted metal, looming against the night sky. Inside, Jade's brave resolve had crumbled into cold, hard terror. Luca Greco circled her, a predator toying with his prey. Marco was tied to a chair in the corner, unconscious. He really doesn't know, does he? Luca sneered, gesturing to Marco. He had no idea his dear friend would be the perfect bait. We just needed the right pressure point. And you, my dear, you were so beautifully, tragically easy to manipulate. The full weight of her mistake crashed down on her. She had walked right into this, driven by a heartbreak that Dante might not even deserve. She had been a fool. The sound was like thunder. The large warehouse doors didn't just open, they exploded inward, torn from their hinges by the force of a black SUV that screeched to a halt in the center of the space. And there he was. Dante stood framed in the wreckage, backlit by the city lights, his figure radiating a lethal calm that was more frightening than any shout. His men flooded in behind him, fanning out. His eyes found Jade instantly, scanning her for injury, and the relief in his gaze was so fleeting it was almost missed, replaced immediately by a cold, murderous focus on Luca. Let her go, Greco. Dante's voice was quiet, but it carried through the vast space like the cocking of a gun. "This is between you and me." Luca laughed, a harsh, brittle sound, and yanked Jade against his chest, a knife appearing in his hand and pressing against her throat. The cold metal bit into her skin. "I think it's between you and my knife, Rossi." What happened next was a blur of controlled violence. Dante moved with a speed that defied reason. He didn't charge. He flowed, a shadow of deadly intent. He disarmed the man closest to him, using the man's own body as a shield against the first volley of gunfire. He was a storm of motion, every movement efficient and brutal. He was fighting his way toward her, his eyes never leaving hers, even as he disabled another man with a sickening crack of bone. He wasn't just fighting to save her, he was fighting to get back to her. Luca, seeing his men fall, snarled and shoved Jade away, turning the knife on Dante as he closed the final distance. They met in a furious clash. It was not an elegant duel, it was a raw, vicious street fight. Dante took a slash to his arm, grunting in pain, but he didn't falter. He grabbed Luca's wrist, twisting it until the bones snapped with an audible pop. The knife clattered to the floor. With a final, powerful blow, he sent Luca sprawling, unconscious, into a heap of old crates. The fight was over. The warehouse fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of the wounded. Dante didn't even look at his fallen enemy. He turned, his chest heaving, his suit jacket torn and blood staining his sleeve. He walked straight to Jade, his eyes wide with a fear that the fight itself had not evoked. He reached her, his hands coming up to cradle her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears she hadn't realized she was crying. He checked the small cut on her neck, his touch infinitely tender. "Jade," he breathed, his voice ragged. "I'm sorry."
I'm so sorry.
"I only found out about your father a week ago. I was trying to find a way to tell you. I could never keep that from you to hurt you. You have to believe me." And she did. Looking into his eyes, seeing the raw, honest pain there, she knew it was the truth. The wall of betrayal shattered, washed away by a flood of relief and love. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her own. He buried his face in her hair. "Our marriage started as a fake," he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "But my love for you is the most real thing I have ever known. It's the only real thing I have." In the days that followed, everything changed. Dante ensured Marco was safe, sober, and given a real chance at a new life, far from the city's underworld. He liquidated his holdings, ceding his territory to Salvatore, who would lead the family into a new, legitimate era. The life of a mafia boss was a life he no longer wanted, not if it meant risking her. On a bright morning, they stood on the deck of a ferry, watching the city's skyline shrink behind them. They held hands, their bags filled not with the trappings of wealth, but with the promise of a simple, peaceful future somewhere new. They were no longer Dante the boss and Jade the fake bride. They were just Dante and Jade, their love story forged in lies but redeemed by a truth more powerful than any of them could have imagined. A love that was real. If you felt every moment of Dante and Jade's journey from a lie to a real, forever love, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where hearts are tested, secrets are revealed, and love always finds a way to win against all odds. Your next favorite romance is just one click away.